Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I have interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of songwriters about the writing process. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So I've always been interested in treating songwriters the same way that we treat poets and traditional prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. There is no talk of how bands get their name, favorite tour stories, favorite foods, band drama, or anything else. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers as we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. That's it, nothing else. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the pod, it's Shura. Shura's latest album, I Got Too Sad for My Friends, is out now. And oh, this was so much fun. I wrote down so many quotes, and you'll hear them in the pod, that I almost ran out of room. So many great pull quotes in this one. Here's one. Actually, before I even say that, let me say this. This is the first podcast I've ever done where I discuss Marcella Hazan's bolognese recipe with a songwriter. Shura brought it up, and I had to kind of do a double take, and I said, did you just mention Marcella Hazan's bolognese? So imagine being able to weave that into a conversation about songwriting. That's how good this was. But here's a couple quotes. Here is one. When I'm peeing, I have really great ideas. And as much as I think that embarrassed Shura to say that, I've heard a lot of songwriters tell me that they get great ideas while they're going to the bathroom. So there's that. And here's another great one. Give me a hike and a walk. And I love that because we talked a lot. I'm a big hiker, and we talked a lot about how important hiking is, specifically hiking, to the creative process. And lastly, I struggle with the editor in me that erases it before it hits the page. And that's something I've just talked a lot with songwriters about, and kind of getting rid of that inner editor, that editor in you that doesn't want to write things down. And I feel like that's been a recurring theme a lot with songwriters I've interviewed, with kind of not being afraid to write the bad stuff first. So anyway, again, oh, I love this conversation. So many, it sure is hilarious, and I love this. So we had a great time. Anyway, I Got Too Sad for My Friend is the latest album by Shura, and enjoy. Let's get started. I always like to start with a pretty simple question, and that is, are you the type of songwriter who feels that it's important to create in some fashion every day? Or some songwriters tell me they do that. Others use the term hibernation because they are seasonal writers. So where do you fall in that?
I would love to fall into the former category. I have often, in fact, sort of made attempts to practice that form of writing and that form of creativity. The artist's way has been read and practiced, but it's just not the way that my brain works. I am absolutely a kind of a hibernation writer. I go through phases. I'm very much, okay, I'm writing now. Now I'm actively not being creative. I'm feeding the brain for later creativity. So I fall into the latter, but much to my own chagrin, I'd love to be able to do something brilliant every day, or at least something every day, and then occasionally maybe it would be brilliant.
But why, I guess? I'm thinking, why do you feel like you need to? Because I feel like you'd be forcing the issue if you're writing when you really don't feel like you're into it.
I think it's because I am aware that it means that I take a long time. So in the case of this record, it's taken 5 years. Now, obviously, there were other factors involved in it being particularly that long. But even the first record took me so long that we created a website called Has Shura Finished Her Album Yet.com, because it became sort of such a joke amongst my fan base. So I'm aware that it makes me slow, that I'm not a prolific writer, that I'm sort of I'm not little and often. I'm little and not very often. And so it's more just yeah, just it would be interesting to me to experience how it might how it might be to be prolific. I think it'd be fun to be prolific for a bit.
But then, if I'm hearing you correctly, when you hibernate, it's not that you don't, it's not that you're agonizing over, I should be writing. It's you are deliberately not writing.
Yeah, I am deliberately not writing. I am deliberately trying to, because I find I don't yeah, I think because so much of what I do and how I write is confessional, it's based on, like, I find it very difficult to write about things that aren't things I have experienced. There's been occasions where I could tell someone else's story, but because I met them and I was just so struck by them, and it inspired me. So it's still kind of an experience I have to go through, and I find I really have to water the brain and nourish feed the brain, because otherwise I think I get stuck. No, otherwise I find that what I'm writing is just not interesting to me, or I'm not interested in pursuing it. So I have to sort of wait for things to happen and for for me to consume other people's art or writing or film, or it could be a video game even. I have to sort of let that happen to me to sort of discover what I'm interested in, if that makes interested in talking about.
So, is there, when you're not writing, is there any anxiety of I should be writing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's anxiety all the time. All the time. Yeah, and it's why, I mean, it's also why I've gone through periods of maybe I should do that thing that a lot of people do, which is get up and write first thing. It doesn't help that I'm not a morning person, so even waking up is a bit of a a bit of a challenge. Um, so yeah, and I'm also I'm open to I I'm open to maybe discovering new ways of writing. I know myself, but at the same time, I'm not committed to that being necessarily myself all the time forever. I'm very open to the idea that I might unlock something else. Yeah, open minded, but not so open minded. My brain falls out. Hopefully.
Do you do other types of writing besides songwriting, journal writing, things like that?
So the thing that I guess I do, and I would do this in periods I'm not writing, if that makes sense, is that I do try to write things down. I do try to have periods of, I would call it observation. Um, I like to watch things happen. I like to people watch. I like to walk a lot, and then maybe as I'm walking, right, or when I get back, write about the things that I saw. Um, that's something actually that was drilled into me by my first kind of major co-collaborator, because I'd written songs alone, from the age of about 13 to when I was signed in my 20s, early 20s, and that was the first time I ever wrote with another person. Um, uh, and Joel Pott, an incredible songwriter, he said, Just do write whatever like, even if you think it's not a song, just write things down, because um, there will be things you come back to that you find interesting in a different context. And actually, I think if there's any piece of kind of writing advice that I've been given that I'm like, that's actually brilliant, and it wasn't an instinct of mine necessarily, it's that, um, because I think so often we can be uh, intimidated by a blank page, and actually just having, I've got so many journals, just full of kind of errant thoughts and observations I've had. and always take them in. I take a huge stack of them in whenever I have a writing session with, whether it's someone I know very well or someone new. I'll take, 5 years of random thoughts I've had, um, and I'll just flick through them. And sometimes there'll just be something there that you're like, oh, that's a really interesting sentence, and you may not even necessarily remember, but my favorite thing is when you do, and you're like, what? I remember exactly where I was when I wrote this, what this was about, even though the sentence doesn't necessarily reveal that. um so it's like a bit of time travel. I think time travel is useful for writing.
So when I talk about this all the time with songwriters, the difference between using a pen and paper or pencil and paper versus typing things out. Because I think that when you go back and you look at those journals, if they were handwritten, you're not going to be taken to that same place that you were if you were looking at something that was typed. So I'm assuming that you're using pen and pencil or pen and paper for these things,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, very occasionally I will write things in my phone, if I don't have pen and paper. But s- if you write things in your phone, you have to sort of. We're always writing things in our phone. We're writing shopping lists. We're writing a to-do list of things that I need to remember, like a podcast recording the next day. Um, and so you have to know what to search for in a way to ever find anything useful. And I think the beauty about pen and paper is that you can flick through kind of like a flip book and a word will catch your eye. So it's like something finds you rather than you finding it. And I do actually sometimes feel ancient. It's just really funny when I go into sessions, particularly for other writers who are younger than me, and they're all on their phone and they've got kind of shared notes and airdropping things. And I'm there like with my notepad and my pen, and I'm just like, oh my God. And I mean that's also what I do. It's mad to me that at university now people are taking their laptops in and writing notes. Well, everything I've ever done was handwritten, and yeah, I don't feel like it's real until you've written it with your hands.
Well, I will say this, if it's any consolation, they've done studies and they found that people retain in university, they found that people retain information better when they take notes with pen and paper versus a computer. So there's something about that connection to the brain. So there is that. But we have 4 children, and I was looking last night at something one of our kids had written when they were in first grade, and I saw that handwriting, and it immediately took me back to that place. And I know that if they had showed me something they typed when they were in first grade, it, I wouldn't have had that same feeling at all.
Yeah. I was actually at my parents' house a couple of weeks ago, and my dad has what we call a baby book, which his mum made, which was a collection of photographs and kind of letters, all these things that he put together. And actually, my dad has made one for both Nick and I, my twin, up until the age of 18, and then it sort of stops because you're not really a baby anymore. There was a letter that he'd written his mum from boarding school, and he must have been about 7 years old. And it was, to me, such a kind of extraordinary experience to see my dad's handwriting as a child. And I was really, really moved by it because I think sometimes we forget our parents were children and have parents. And it's something that I really try not to forget, actually. And I often find myself purposefully asking because I never got to meet my grandparents. I try to really ask my parents a lot about their parents because I hate the idea of one day maybe having children who don't get to meet for whatever reason my parents, and them not knowing about them and them not existing really. Sorry, that's a bit kind of a random random existential crisis segue. But yeah, no, it was just really beautiful to see his handwriting as a child, and I was like, God, it's such a great thing that you've kept that.
But I think that relates to songwriting because I think if you're looking as a songwriter, I would imagine it's easier to conjure and recall those memories if you can put yourself back in the place. And handwriting does that in a way that a notes app doesn't. And I don't think that's me being an old man, but I think that's just the way we operate.
Yeah.
It's like a photograph.
Yeah. And there's no autocorrect as well. So you're like, oh wow, yeah, I still struggle with which there is the right there. Even though I studied English, I'm like, oh goodness, why am I writing it like that?
All right, so I'm going to get very specific with a couple of questions because I could do probably a whole blog dedicated to the color of ink and the brands of pens or pencils and or paper that songwriters like, and wow, are they particular about those things. So how important is color of ink, type of pen, things like that to you?
I it's not I'm actually quite flexible. I do like pencil because there's something about pencil. I never do erase. But the impermanence of pencil is sort of exciting me. Um, the fact that it can change and fade. And also, I was a big drawer. I used to draw a lot as a child, so it takes me back to kind of that time of my life where I loved pencil drawing and I loved shading. So pencil would probably be my favorite. I am also honestly partial to a Sharpie, which I'm ashamed to say because the first thing I think of now when I think of Sharpie is Donald Trump's signature, and it just made. And I'm just like, I do this. I don't want to share anything with that human being. But there's something kind of, so it's very, very permanent and very like it even seeps through the page, which means that in my notebooks, if I write in Sharpie, I can't use the reverse. But there's something sort of fun about that, and then sort of seeing the print that it leaves. So yeah, I'm a pencil or Sharpie girl, which is very like
S-
complete opposite ends of the spectrum.
They are very opposite. So I had on Jerry Harrison of the Talking Heads a couple of months ago, and he told me he started out as a visual artist too, and he said that he loves a felt tip pen because he loves the sensation of the scraping. That was his quote on the page, and I love that. Um,
Scent though, there's something felt tip is really it sounds nice, it feels nice. Um to write with. Yeah, I never really thought about the sound, but then as soon as you retell that, I'm like, yeah, it's so there is something sort of it's like shh. Yeah, it just makes a kind of like shh sound.
yeah. So here's the other thing, and I love the specificity of these answers, but when people, and I guess you use a pencil, so so when you erase something, aren't you worried that if you erase it? So I guess my way of saying this, songwriters who use like ballpoint pens, the question is if do they cross something out or do they frantically scribble it? I had Beach Bunny, Lily from Beach Bunny on, and she said her quote was, I scribble into oblivion because she doesn't want to ever see that thing that she was crossing out. And I think, wow, if you erase, like you have no option there whatsoever. So where do what's your take on that?
I mean I love that people do that. I don't. So even though I say I love the impermanence of pencil, I never scratch anything out or I never even I might do a single line so that I can still read and be like, don't go there. But I would never cross it out to the point where I couldn't see. And often what I find myself doing is I'll write, and if there's a line that at the time of writing I'm particularly intrigued by, I'll sort of draw around it in like a bubble or like a star. So I'll highlight things for myself and then often not come back to that page for a while. And then the first thing I'll look at will be that line because I've sort of earmarked it for myself. And I'll either instinctively go, yeah, I was onto something there, or I'll be like, wow, what was going on? But no, I don't. I never erase. I think I struggle from uh, something that I really fight against is the editor in me that erases it before it's even hit the page. So I think I do enough erasing already that if I were to also erase what's on the page, then I'd end up with not very much. And I'm constantly in a battle with that person. And that's why actually going back, the observations in the writing, that really trying to just observe and write is helpful to me because I'm not making a judgment about a line. I'm just telling the piece of paper, the world, what is happening. And that helps me to get it onto the page because that's almost my biggest struggle is getting it there in the first place. So once it's there, I'm like, no, you can stay. I'm not going to erase anything. This is all precious.
Which is a great segue into my next question. I have a quote here that the songwriter I had on Christian Lee Hudson on a couple of months ago, and he said exactly what we're talking about. His quote directly is, "My biggest hurdle as a writer is trying to hack my brain to become less critical." And that's a struggle with prose writers, in general. And I interviewed the writer Anthony Doerr about 10 years ago, and he wrote a fantastic book called All the Light We Cannot See that won the Pulitzer Prize. And I asked him about writer's block, and he goes, "I don't believe in writer's block." He said it was a failure of courage. And you can't be afraid to write the bad stuff. And I think that's what we're talking about here is getting everything out there and not making the judgment calls. And that's what Hudson says is, you know, is not being critical as you write. And it sounds like that's the struggle with that's all of our struggles, I think, isn't it?
I think it's all of ours. I think some people are more perfectionist orientated, and to go back to kind of draw, my drawing and my kind of artistic sort of instincts as a child. I remember coloring in books, and coloring outside of the line was the worst thing that anyone could possibly do to my coloring in book. And I have a twin, and I used to get very, very angry at him when he would ever do that. So I think there's always been this perfectionist in me, and there's something brilliant about that, but it's also kind of my curse. And it's the perfectionist in me is the person I'm often fighting with the most, because it's not actually useful, I think. um Really, it's maybe satisfying when you feel like you've got something perfect. There's a satisfaction there, but in terms of actually um expressing yourself and the freedom to, like, I always say, with when people have asked me advice about kind of going into sessions with other people, I say you have to go in and be with people who you're not afraid to suck in front of. Like, you will say things and have ideas and write things down that are not very good, and you have to just be um, comfortable with that. Yeah, so I mean, it's a big struggle, and I think sometimes I win that battle, and sometimes I don't. And that's my particular that's my particular internal war happening up here.
There's a story about the writer Joseph Conrad, and he wrote to his cousins about a 10-page letter about how he had writer's block, ignoring the irony that he just wrote a 10-page letter.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm fascinated by that idea. I mean, again, the failure of courage is i- i- Anthony Doerr's point was, no one's that important. Just get the damn stuff down.
Yeah.
And to me, at least, when I was a professor, I would tell my students, writer's block happens not because we don't know what to say, but because we don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
And just start to write, and the momentum will keep you going. And a prose writer I mean, the biggest curse as a prose writer is to revise as you write. That's the equivalent. Is if you are the type of writer that says, "I'm not going to write sentence two until sentence one is perfect," you'll never finish anything.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm a big fan of, I hate the phrase word vomit because I don't think anyone really does that. I think at some point when you're typing, you are thinking about that next word you're going to type. But the novelist Anne Lamott, she has a book called Bird by Bird, and there's an essay in there that I would give my students. It's called Shitty First Drafts. And that's her idea, is the first draft. It's a great essay. Shitty first
Yeah.
drafts. You got to get everything out there.
Yeah.
Uh, because I don't think and again, I'm a prose writer, not a songwriter, but my thought is when I start to write, I don't think I have any right knowing what something is supposed to look like
Yeah.
when I'm finished. Like, that's the biggest fault. The biggest mistake I can make is to say, I'm going to start here. I'm going to end here. Here's how I'm going to get there, because it doesn't allow me to make any diversions, any detours. I don't have any right knowing. Um, that's me as a prose writer, but how often does that happen to you? Is that important as a songwriter?
Well, I mean, I'd like to maybe just pause for a second and contemplate my own experience of writer's block, because in many ways I agree and can see like the take of like the failure of courage. And I think in some instances, absolutely, it's being afraid to not be perfect or be brilliant. But I think what was, I'd never really, so it happened to me, and it's partly why the album took a while. Um, and it was the first time it had ever happened to me, really, even though I go through periods where I'm like, I'm writing now, and now I'm not writing. Um, And what really struck me, or what I'd what the problem I didn't understand how to solve, was that it felt like my actual brain um had sort of calcified. Um it felt like it was no longer an organ, it was a rock or a brick, and that there was no, the particles weren't moving, there was no like electricity there. Um it it felt like a weight inside my skull, in that I had something in my skull, but it wasn't really functioning as a brain. And I remember really trying to write, and nothing nothing would come at all. It was kind of, so that was really that was that was really scary, actually. I remember just being like, "Oh, maybe it's gone. Maybe the brain, maybe that's my brain now forever." Um, and I think obviously that's must be in part, it must have been, a depressive episode, and there must have been a chemical imbalance, or there must have been things that were not, the brain is an organ like any other brain in the body, and when it's not functioning properly, like, you change. So I changed, and I didn't know if I was ever going to change back. So that was kind of strange. And I think I veered so far off kind of where we were and what you were asking, that I now no longer remember where I'm going. But I definitely really, I remember saying to my songwriter friend, who's a bit older than me, and I was calling them for kind of advice, and saying that that's it. I'm never going to write a song again. My brain is a brick. That's it. And they were just like, I've been there so many times. You're
So what did you do? How did you solve that?
um I don't know. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think walking. I think walking. Um I think walking and sitting. Um because that's the first thing I wrote about when I could write again. It was about walking through Brooklyn, sitting on a park bench, feeling the air move across my face. And they're very simple things. And I would never normally write a song about the breeze, but that's where I was, and that's what I could reach. Um, and I think writing that song, it's a song called Richardson on my new record, um, because it was also the first song I wrote alone in about 10 years since I sort of started this, like completely alone without kind of any other collaborators. I think it was a really powerful realization for me, like, oh no, you do this. This is what you do. You're a songwriter. You don't need anyone else. Like, it's fun. Um, so yeah, I think it was just walking and feeling. And I think back to kind of my first record, and I was struggling a lot with kind of anxiety and panic attacks. And my management were like, you should go and try therapy. And I went to see a therapist, and she would ask me, she sort of asked me this question once, and it was really weird. She's like, how do your legs feel? Like, how does your body feel? How do your legs feel kind of sat in this chair? I was like, what do you mean, how do my legs feel? It was She's like, well, how do they feel? Like, what do you feel in your body? I was like, I don't feel them. Um, and then she said, well, how do you know you have legs then? And I was like, well, I can see them. I can see my legs. And she was like, close your eyes. And I closed my eyes. She's like, do you have legs? And I was like, yeah. She's like, how do you know? And I was like, I can feel the chair. And she was like, there you go. You can feel the chair that you're sat on, and sort of explain to me how I was, until that point, kind of walking around like a floating head, like a just like a head in a jar, like from a sci-fi novel. And she said, "No wonder you're, you're struggling and you're anxious. You're this kind of disembodied brain, going about life, but you have this body that's attached to you." So I think almost reconnecting with my body, walking, and walking, feeling, observing. Yeah, I think that's probably how it happened.
Well, I want to ask you about I want to talk about walking, but I think my response to that is you you know, you had, I mean, it's not that you couldn't write. Like if I had asked you to write about, you couldn't write a song. I think that was the thing
Yeah,
about Joseph Conrad. It was that you just couldn't write a song. But if I said, go outside and write for a half hour about the trees outside, you could do that. And right. And I think that's the difference. And the problem with writer's block is it's like insomnia, that you start to think about why you can't go to sleep, and you start thinking about why you can't write.
yeah,
Um, and often it's that breakthrough of doing something else, because again, it's not that you couldn't write, is you couldn't write that song.
yeah.
Um, which I
And
find,
sorry,
sorry.
sorry. No, I was going to say, of course, that's what I did. I would walk, and then I would take a coffee and sit on a park bench, and I would write about everything. So I would write, and that's what the first song became. And maybe at another point in my life, when I was in my early 20s making 80s synth pop, writing a song about walking and feeling the breeze on my face wasn't exciting. But because I hadn't written a song in so long, I was like, this is a miracle.
Yeah. And that's all you need, right? You just need one of those moments of momentum to keep you going.
Absolutely. And to realize that not everything has to be about something big.
So the walking, there's a great book by Adam Sisman called The Friendship, and it's about the relationship between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And they estimate Wordsworth walked 100,000 miles in his life, which is some obscene amount. I mean, I guess back then you had nothing else to do, but he would walk like, uh, you know, 30 miles, which is whatever, it's at about 50 kilometers a day in the Lake District. I mean, nothing else to do. But here's what's amazing, um, that both Wordsworth and Coleridge would compose all of their poems on walks. And I forgot, one needed a rocky terrain, one needed a flat terrain. I forgot which one. But Wordsworth had such an incredible memory, he would compose his poems on his walks and wouldn't come back until he had revised them in his head, which uh,
Wow.
that's other word. Now, I'm not sure he did the prelude because that would be way too long. But I want to talk a lot about movement because I think that's crucial. Now, there's a lot of ways we can go with this. There's the walking around and observing and filling your mind. But to me, when I walk, I need to be inward. And so I need to be walking in a place I've been to a million times before so I can look inwards. And that's my way of doing it. But walking to me is tremendous. So let's talk about that because the role of movement, I think, is critical to the creative process. But it sounds to me like when you walk, you're using that as inspiration. And one more thing, and then I'll stop, and that is that with driving, it's the same way. Like when I drive, my mind can wander, but it's got to be a place I've driven, so I can almost put my brain on autopilot.
Yeah. I mean, you s- you say that, and I am absolutely observing, but I'm also going on a complete journey in here. And I am, when I am walking, especially those walks that I feel are necessary. Because I walk every day. I'll get a coffee in the morning, but there are some walks where I'm like, I need to go for a walk and I need to just think. And actually, I wonder if part of that, I used to smoke, and one of my favorite things about that was that it would be time for me to just sit or walk and think. It was time that I was afforded to just be here. So whenever I do walk, I am often looking inward and somehow also observing. And it's always around it's not very far. Like it might literally be a 10-minute loop. Um, yeah, it's, but it's, It sort of depends on the walk. Like one walk I remember I fell and I slipped, and there was a man holding. I remember he had because I remember because I wrote it down, and he was holding this blue and white striped plastic bag with his whatever he had just bought, and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Be careful, it's slippy." Like, I didn't answer the question. I just warned him. And then I sort of ran off in that way that you do when you fall and you sort of want to kind of just like not be perceived anymore. So I will sort of ponder things, like in a kind of like internally and look inward. But there are also things that happen on walks where I write them down, like that incident, or once seeing. I remember there's a house few streets away, and there was like um a statue of Mary, Jesus's mother, in the window, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I saw the woman who lived there kind of just staring, and we sort of had this moment where we just kind of made eye contact. And then I wandered off, and there were two guys in running gear. Like, it's weird. There's two guys running, and I remember they were both wearing shorts and t-shirts. And I remember because I wrote it down, and it's not interesting, and it will never make it into a song probably. But because I write it, I remember, and I think I love writing about walks. I love
But you're
writing.
walking this but you're walking kind of the same it sounds like you're walking the same place every day.
Often, yeah. I mean, I might do slight deviations, and if there's, if I'm going to a different part of London, then it will have. But yeah, I do sort of insist on walking every day for at least 15 minutes because I think partly it's a mental health thing. I think vitamin D, obviously, and whenever I feel a bit restless, I think it's what you just need to take yourself out of your immediate environment. Um, yeah,
I'd be
I
cur
do.
I'd be curious if it were different if you walked, in Hyde Park or in a where it's a much more natural environment rather than a residential area, if that would be different for your creativity.
I almost certainly would be, and I mean, I love hiking. I do love, outside of the walk around my immediate vicinity. I love hiking, and actually, one of my favorite things to do is to be in the mountains. Like, if I could go on a holiday, it would not be a beach. It would be like, go to the Andes, go to the mountains, get as high as you can, get as close to space as you can, without being a physicist or an astronaut. There's something about the vastness of and the desolateness of that. And actually, I just rewatched, rather embarrassingly, The Horse Whisperer 2 days ago. I don't know. I'd found out my partner hadn't seen it. I was like, "What? You haven't seen The Horse Whisperer?" And it was all these beautiful shots of Montana, and I was just like, "God, I need to be in the mountains." So yeah. I mean, yeah. It's just I can't drive, so it's quite hard to get to them.
So I'm so glad you said this because I am much more of a hiking person too, mountains person. My wife is a beach person, so we don't agree on that at all. Um, and I have never felt so present in my life as a writer, as a person, being aware of my existence as when I am hiking in Montana, Wyoming, which I went to last summer, and but here's what's different. If I'm hiking a somewhat technical hike, I'm practically watching out for snakes and rocks and not breaking my ankle. But if I'm in a space where it's vast and there's a prairie and there's a plain, and that's when I'm much more introspective. That's what I need. And I can't stop the thoughts. Like they can't, I'm filled with creativity in those areas. But it's funny you say that because I do need that terrain to be most creative.
Yeah. I mean, my dream, something I've always dreamt of doing, is to just really do that thing of go somewhere like that for 6 months, just where you have there's nothing to look at except for the mountains. And I'd really love to explore that, like what it's like to be creative in an environment like that. And I think for that would be something that is I've not really been able to do, that I think would be a really interesting sort of exercise. Um, yeah, I'm very, very drawn to mountains, actually. Very kind of read quite obsessively. In fact, I was saying earlier in our conversation that studying English literature somewhat extinguished my love of fiction. But one thing I love to read is nonfiction, and a lot of what I read is about like mountains and mountaineering and stuff like that. Yeah.
I go, I have a work trip every year out to Northern California for a client, and what I'll do is, I will spend a weekend out there in Northern California, and there's a park called Pinnacles National Park, and it's only one of the two places in the US where the California condors are, and the condors were virtually extinct until the government brought them back, and they're these hideously ugly they have 8-foot wingspans, and they're not, I mean, there's nothing about them that's beautiful. Um, but I take the same hike every year, and I've done it for about 5 years, and it is up in the mountains and it's rocky, but I know the hike well, so it allows me to be contemplative when I'm doing it. But if you're lucky to see the condors, and it's an incredibly big park. I mean, it's huge. So there's only about 30 birds, and you're probably not likely to see them, but I see them every year, and whenever I see them, it's this experience of awareness, because you're seeing this bird that was almost extinct, and it floods me with feelings to see that. So I can see that completely, that like the beach would never do that.
Yeah, I can't think of. I honestly, actually, I would be. I'm bored. Yeah, I'd be so bored. I am bored at the beach. The idea of lying down and doing nothing. In the hot. No. I want. Give me a hike and a walk.
All right, now let's talk about the ritual, because you did mention you're not a morning person. And I do think there are certain quirks I have. Like for me, I never write and revise in the same place. Like if I'm writing here, I'll revise in that chair behind me. Um, I also need temporal distance to be able to revise, spatial and temporal. There's certain things I like to have with me. So, how important is that ritual, whether it's time of day, room, chair, things like that, when you write?
Um, where I write, um, become not actually that important to me. Um, when I started, it had to be in my bedroom, and it had to be at a volume that nobody could hear. Because I didn't want anyone to know what I was doing. I was a teenager, and was somewhat embarrassed and didn't want anyone to know. So it was very private, and very had to be kind of in one place. And then just by kind of the nature of what I do and being asked to sort of, write with other people. And I've learned to sort of really be able to sort of write wherever I am. Um, in terms of revision, also not important where, but I definitely need time. Um, I am refining lyrics right until the moment I commit them to kind of recording. I will change things at the very last minute, and the kind of things that no one else would care about, that no one else would notice, that my producer is probably like, why bother? um, you know, the most obvious, and even now I'm sort of like, actually, was that the right decision? Like I'm even now still sort of going, oh, maybe I should have left it as it was. There's a line in Richardson um, where I I said originally it was I lost my mind out in Brooklyn, and I changed it to ran out of line out in Brooklyn because I thought lost my mind maybe felt a bit on the nose. And loved this idea of like that climbing thing, or like like you're leading the rope, and that's it. That's as far as you go. That to me was more interesting. And I don't know if anyone will ever people will probably just think of fishing. So really, again, it's one of those changes that doesn't matter to half the people won't even realize what I'm saying because I don't enunciate very well. Even my mum is like, "Please, can you print the lyrics out for me? Because I have no idea what you're saying." Um, so yeah, I changed that, and I will chop words out. even once I've recorded them sometimes. And um, so, yeah, I love to refine over a period of time. And I'm sure my record label would prefer that period of time was shorter than it is. But again, it's that perfectionist of like, can I get 5% more out of this? Can something be improved? Does it need to rhyme? Can it actually, is it better if it doesn't? Is it the same word again, actually? All those kind of questions I ask myself.
When we were editing the book, when I was editing and revising our book, that was my question: is if I change this, is anyone going to notice? Because with prose, you can there's no endpoint. I mean, that was the problem. And I thought, okay, is anyone going to even notice if I make this change? And that was the best thing I could come up with is, how do you know when this thing is done?
Mm. Well,
Um,
that's literally the most essential part of the creative process. Is that is that this knowing that, like the knowing the answer to that question. And actually, I there are so many incredible songwriters I know or musicians I know who are so good that they're never done, and so they never put anything out. And in some ways, I feel really blessed to be not as gifted as them, because there is really a point where I go, this is as good as I can get it. Actually, I think, and so it's done. So at that part, I've never actually the letting go. I'm quite good at. I just like to. It's like Marcella Hazan's Bolognese. I like project cooks. So I like my albums to be like project cooks. So I like to take a long time, but I do know when it's done. Yeah.
Wait, the bolognese, is that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wait,
So
who did you say again?
it's Marcella Hazan, her like 6 hour Bolognese. Have you ever made it?
Mm, so many times I can't even I've lost track. So the New York Times cooking app is what I have, and if you read the notes, everyone has their idea of how you can perfect perfection, and most people just say, "Just shut up, just make the damn thing the way that she says to make it," and it is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I literally read the recipe and there was no garlic in it. And I was like, are you joking? Okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it as is prescribed. And if I want garlic in it, I can always put it in. I made it. And I am team there is no such thing as too much garlic. And yeah, it does not need garlic. It just doesn't. It works. And it takes 6 hours and it's the best. So yeah, I kind of, yeah, project cooks and project records. That's I like something to take, like to feel like you've done something.
Amazing. Okay, so 2 quick follow-ups. One is, I think you said you're not a morning person, so are you a right through the night type of person?
Um, I mean, often I will write things down in bed. I find it quite difficult to fall asleep. Um, I find that nighttime is when I decide is the appropriate time to try and solve all the world's problems at once. So I slightly suffer from kind of a struggle to fall asleep, but it does give me this bit of time to sometimes just write down sort of mad thoughts. And I do sometimes think maybe my internal inner critic editor is almost quietest then because it's just quite frenetic. Whereas I think in the morning, which is weird because they say get up and write in the morning because you're sort of half asleep and you won't. Whereas in the morning, I'm just there like, well, I'm not going to write that. Like, I need a coffee first. Like, what? So I think, yeah, I do like to write things down. Often, this is a very strange detail that's maybe too much information, but often, when I'm writing, I'm in the studio or at night, I'll be like, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And actually, when I'm peeing, I have really great ideas. It's really strange, but it's just a thing. I'm like, if I'm struggling with a lyric, I'm like, right, I'm going to take a bathroom break and I'll be peeing and I'll just be sort of sat there and thinking and I'll just be like, got it.
And I wish I could remember the songwriter who told me that they edit when they are fatigued because it's less of a battle when they just are. And I love that you say that, that awareness of, if I'm tired, it'll be less of a fight and a decision whether I should be taking something out or not.
Yeah.
So, okay, last question. We talked literature, so let's end with that. And I think you mentioned, so I'm not a I'm not an author person. My first thought after reading something is, what else can I read by someone else? Because I want multiple voices in my head. Um, and I'm not really a genre person either. I just go by, okay, I finished a book and let me see what the New York Times, who are the people, who are the book reviewer, what do the book reviewers say is good? But I'd love to know what your reading habits are.
I am very different. It's not dissimilar to my the way I consume music actually as well. Is I fall in love with authors, or and then I read everything. So the first author I guess I fell in love with was Jane Austen. As you know, 13-year-old reading these books, and we had the kind of a great adaptation on the BBC that was fantastic. So I kind of loved that. So that was my first. That's when I was like, books, great, I like this. The second one that I sort of really remember having a love affair with was, so my older brother moved to Japan uh, to teach English. Um, and he gave me a book by Haruki Murakami. And so I read I did, I really kind of went there and I was like, magical realism. And I read everything. And then so I fell in love and kind of read all of his books, and then was like, well, I love this genre. Um, so I was like, I'm going to look for more magical realism, and then discovered South American literature. So I read Allende, Marquez, and then I was like, and this is where the mountain love affair started. I read these books. Um, I was 21, whatever, finished university. My granddad had left a little bit of money for both me and my twin. And my twin, I think, had spent it all on kind of clothes and stuff. And I didn't really want to do that. So I was like, I'm going to go to South America on my own, because I was so struck by, taken with these books. I needed to understand where more about the place that they were written, where they were written. And I went to Bolivia and Peru, Chile, Argentina. I was there for 6 months, learnt Spanish, climbed through the Andes, saw the Sula Grande, where kind of touching the void, that mountain, caught fish and in a river, and just put salt on it and ate it. And I don't even really like fish, and it was the most delicious fish that I'd ever eaten. So yeah, I really I fall in love with authors. I fall in love with genres. And then my dissertation, what I wrote on, it was J.M. Coetzee. Of course, the way I did it was like, I didn't just pick like one book to write about. I was like, oh, explore the relationship between parents and children in his entire work. I was like, oh no, now I have to really read and know everything inside out. I was like, maybe I should have been a bit more kind of targeted. But yeah, Coetzee I really loved. But now I mostly read nonfiction and memoir. Memoir, I think, really, really waters my brain because it doesn't feel so far from songwriting. Like, it feels like it's really good fuel for songwriting, because it's sort of fictionalized, but also not. I love Maggie Nelson. I love Olivia Lang. I love what was the book? Of course, I've forgotten the kind of Year of Magical Thinking, Joan Didion, and that really kind of just blew my socks off. Yeah,
I've got a great recommendation for you. The book is called Miracle Country, and the woman's name is Kendra Attleywork. And she wrote a book. She grew up in the mountains in California, Northern California, a very small town, Sierra Nevada area, I think, in a very small town in Northern California, the part of Northern California that Los Angeles gets all its water from because it owns part of Northern California, and literally they draw that water from hundreds of miles away because they built that city in a desert. Anyway,
that's such a wild fact.
amazing book. She wrote it in her mid 20s, maybe early 20s, and it's not that old. The book was in the past 10 years, Miracle Country. And I read an essay by her, and then I read the book, and it is phenomenal. But it's about her growing up in that small town, and it also touches on environmental issues. So it's kind of like a good discussion of those things as well. It's fascinating. Um, Okay, one quick follow-up, and that is, are you the type of person I finally have given myself permission to quit books that I don't like, and I used to be the kind of person that said, "I've gotta finish it," but can you can you stop?
I'm a big believer in put down the book, leave the play, leave the play. If the play isn't good, like because the play can be good, but the performance of the play can be bad. And I think life is too short to spend a long time. Don't invest in something that's not giving you anything. Like, and there can be books that other people love that you don't, and that's fine.
But how do you know? Is there a certain page? Do you go 50 pages or just no? Do you just
It
know it?
it takes a while. So, for instance, I just finished a book that I loved, but I didn't to begin with, because I misunderstood what the book was, and it was Orbital, and I thought it was going to be nonfiction because I just didn't read anything about it, and I was just like, "Oh, a book about space, perfect." So I was reading about all these astronauts, and I was like, "Wow, they're fascinating. I've never heard of these characters before. I'm going to Google them." And then I was like, "Oh, it's fiction." I'm such a miss. I was like, "Well, no, I'm not interested in it. It's not real." And then I was like, "Shura, calm down." And I read another couple of chapters and got to this incredible passage where one of the astronauts' parents died whilst they were there. And she was talking about, there were two moments actually, she was talking about how she didn't want to go back to Earth because then that would mean that she was where it was, where the place where her mother no longer was. And I was really grief, any writing about sort of, I've not really experienced grief, and so writing about grief I feel like I really gets me, because I'm like, I want to prepare, as if you can't. I'm like doing my homework because I'm like, that's going to be awful. Prepare as much as one can. So I do a bit of that. But then there was this amazing passage where they're talking about the picture, the moonrise, Earthrise, sorry, Earthrise, and how one of the astronauts sort of says, "Oh, isn't it amazing that every human that is alive and has ever lived is in that picture?" And it blew my mind. And I was like, Pauline, to my partner, I was like, "Have you ever thought about this?" And she just goes, "Well, no, you can't see anyone." I was like, "Oh, okay." And then I get to the next page and the Russian astronaut responds going like, "No, there's no one. There's no life, no sign of life there. In fact, only sign of life is person taking picture. And what about the other side you cannot see?" And I was like, "Wait, how is I'm half Russian. How is my French partner like the Russian astronaut in this situation?" And I was just there like, wow, it's every human that had ever lived and ever will. Anyway, so that really kind of the ways that two people, even two people who love each other, some people can be beach people, some people can be mountain people, two people who, love each other can see things in completely different ways, and there's sort of magic in that. And that's also the magic of people hearing your own music and being like, "I love that it says this," and you're like, "Oh, that's not what I meant at all." But I love that.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can find all the episodes on all major streaming platforms and also at the Songwriters on Process website. That is at songwritersonpodcast.com. Pre-2020, this was not a pod. I was transcribing all of the interviews. So you can find all of them, hundreds of them, many hundreds of them on the Songwriters on Process website. You'll find both the transcribed interviews and the pod there. Take a deep dive, spend a day. These are great conversations with songwriters just about the writing process. Also, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, is out now worldwide on Hachette Books. You can find it online in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God, and it's his memoir. Again, that is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. I am biased, but that's a damn good book. My email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I love suggestions, questions, comments. People always email me and tell me who they want to see on the pod next. You never know. Send me an email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. That's it for me, everyone. Have a great day.